un gusto saludarlos. Nuevamente estamos en una nueva edición del Club de Lectura ESG. Un gusto volver a saludarlos, último miércoles de cada mes para que se vayan acostumbrando y bueno, muy contentos de poder continuar esta iniciativa que nació en el 2022, que en el transcurso del 2023 fuimos madurando y que ya para este 2024 hemos decidido ampliarlo y poder llegar a más y más personas a través de Latam Green. Así que pues muy contentos de tener ya esta segunda edición del Club de Lectura apoyado por Latam Green. Y bueno, hoy con un invitado muy especial, un libro que nos estamos leyendo y disfrutando que se llama ESG Mindset, y pues tuvimos el privilegio de poder invitar a su autor, Mathhew Sekol, para que nos acompañara hoy, para que nos cuente un poco sobre el libro, por qué lo escribió y bueno, muchas cosas alrededor de el conocimiento que él tiene sobre los temas ESG. Pero bueno, antes de dar la bienvenida a Mathhew, quiero saludar a Jessica y bueno, nuevamente qué rico estar contigo en estos espacios.
No, a ti Eduardo, muchas gracias y gracias a toda la audiencia de Latam Green que nos acompaña en esta segunda edición del Club de Lectura. La edición pasada nos acompañó Gema Sacristán y tuvimos una conversación muy interesante con algunos problemas técnicos, pero la pueden encontrar en nuestro canal de YouTube disponible, así como los próximos clubs de lectura que vamos a tener disponibles en el canal para que si no pueden sintonizarse en el momento, pueden compartirlo, escucharlo con calma, ya que vamos a tener un banco pues, de todas estas conversaciones sobre lecturas ESG. Entonces, pues muy contentos de tener un excelente invitado para esta segunda edición. Y bueno, los dejaré de la mano pues de Eduardo, que va a liderar esta conversación en esta ocasión. Y bueno, agradecerte nuevamente por acompañarnos y ser parte de esta iniciativa, Eduardo.
A ti, Jessica, un abrazo y nuevamente el agradecimiento al equipo de Latam Green por hacer realidad esta iniciativa del Club de Lectura ESG en su nueva versión.
Gracias.
Entonces, un tema importante para esta sesión es que nuestro invitado pues, está basado en los Estados Unidos y su español no es su lengua primordial o primera. Entonces este será un club de lectura ESG especial porque haremos la sesión en inglés. Entonces, no siendo más, I want to welcome Mathhew. And Mathhew, thanks a lot for making the time today and join us in this ESG book club. We are going to talk about a book that is called ESG Mindset. So it's the perfect book for this kind of book clubs. So yeah, thanks so much for making the time today with us. And let's start with the conversation. And obviously, before we go deeper with your book, please go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about you.
Sure. So my name is Mathhew Sekol. Most people call me Matt. I work at Microsoft on the commercial side of sustainability. So I talk to companies mostly around the Americas and partners on how to approach sustainability, how to think about ESG. I also sit on the LP advisory committee of a fund that Morgan Stanley finances and Microsoft finances called the Next Level Fund, which invests in diverse led and founded startups. It's a little bit of a VC kind of ESG fund because they're often trying to solve ESG problems that affects sometimes their groups and their own experiences. I came into this space from my time supporting capital markets here at Microsoft. So coming at it through kind of the finance lens and seeing how investors look at ESG, but then realizing that a lot of companies weren't quite putting together the way that investors were looking at their companies when they would say ESG and kind of conflating it with sustainability and other topics like that versus really what ESG is. And some investors conflate that too. So that's what led me to write the book. So now I'm a newly minted author and I'm thrilled to be here today talking to you about the book.
That's awesome. Yeah. So let's go and talk about the book and let's start with what you mentioned. You hear about sustainability or corporate responsibility, but your book ESG Mindset trying to talk about the concept, the core concept of ESG. Can you tell us if a company is looking to work on ESG, how that is different from like traditional ways to understand this topic?
Sure. Yeah, it's a really interesting question because I think we're all very familiar with how business has traditionally operated, and even with kind of how what we used to call CSR, we still do, corporate social responsibility, has kind of come up through over the years in CSR reports and impact reports. And ESG is really something a little bit different. Although I'd caution everybody on the phone, or on the call, whenever you talk to somebody about ESG, their definition may not be this one. But I go back to the UN Environmental Programme's Finance Initiative definition from 2004. There's a white paper called Who Cares Wins, very much focused on the finance perspective, but ESG was born out of the finance perspective. So let's start with the definition. So the way I define ESG in the book is as the material, environmental, social, and governance risks that affect a company and the opportunities that drive towards long-term value and sustainable growth. Now, the idea of materiality, the effects on a company, instead of kind of the company's impact out, and the pursuit of this long-term value makes ESG a little bit differentiated from things like CSR. Although it can get complicated and muddied pretty quickly, because as we all know, things that a company does can indeed come back and impact it. So I started thinking about ESG in terms of a mindset specifically sometime around 2022. I was chatting with a friend of mine up in Canada, and we kind of came to the conclusion that a mindset is what is needed to address ESG issues. Because looking at the landscape of companies, we very much saw this traditional business mindset kind of leading the pack and not being able to address some of these new issues that were coming up. Now, since then, I've come to realize that it even means more than just understanding ESG as a concept and having that mindset. What it really means is understanding the unique position across all aspects of the business with that lens towards environmental, social, and governance issues. For example, for me working at a technology company, that means understanding how the cloud uses energy or how social bias can emerge when using a tool like artificial intelligence. Addressing these issues through this ESG mindset can help ensure long-term growth by reducing risks or finding new opportunities, not separate from those traditional business factors, but aligned with those traditional business factors. And there are some that argue that this isn't necessarily something new, like ESG isn't necessarily new because all businesses should be looking at these issues and all businesses should be focused on the long term. Nobody wants to run a business that's only for the short term. But the reality is most shareholders hold US equities for under a year. So investors have this very short-term focus, which means management teams sometimes have this very short-term focus. And I think one quick example is layoffs, for example. Laying off staff has long been a mechanism for companies to manage really hard times, but also hard costs. You reduce the salaries, you kind of, you could take more share of profit. But there are social costs to an activity like layoffs. Attrition, low productivity for people who remain, the costs of rehiring and retraining. Something like an ESG mindset helps uncover these issues and can add to kind of the traditional perspective of business.
That's really good. That's really good. And thanks for making this explanation, because as you can imagine, as the concept of both ESG or sustainability or corporate responsibility gets more and more momentum, the confusion is quite is going hand in hand with the more people talking about this. So I think having that clarity and understanding, for example, from where the ESG concept came, and especially from this financial perspective, I think is quite relevant. And as you can imagine, as more and more companies and more executives of companies want to understand both sustainability or the most important ESG issues, the main question, or one of the main questions that all the executives have, is about benefits. How this benefit my company? How this is going to improve my company? So, from your experience and writing your book, The ESG Mindset, how companies can identify benefits from having an ESG mindset?
Yeah, so I'll start off by saying a couple of years ago, there was very much the perspective that ESG was a win-win right off the bat. Like, you're doing something sustainable, it'll make you money. That is often not necessarily the case. There are trade-offs, as with anything in business. So coming to ESG topics with the reality of how business operates is very key. But there are a lot of benefits to be had, even if that win-win is a little bit elusive. Certainly, the long-term sustainability and building a resilient business is definitely one type of benefit, but this can be very difficult to do with the way modern businesses operate. There's been a lot of value shifted from things like tangible assets, physical locations, physical products even, to intangible intellectual property over the past few decades. And so it's no longer simply enough to have the most of something or the best of something. ESG really represents kind of a new and balanced way to consider your business. Even though it's been around for 20 years, it has definitely gotten a lot of attention just in the past few years. It means things like understanding how a carbon reduction in one area of your business might require an investment in that area to get there. Like, for example, doing a material substitution of something. So trading off one type of component, like maybe a plastic heavy component, to something else that's lower carbon, for example. It may also mean doing things that are a little bit unnatural to get those benefits, like partnering with your competitors to transition your suppliers to some of those new materials in your product, which lifts an entire industry and maybe kind of reduces that competitive advantage a little bit, but maybe it will make your products last longer in the long run across the market. And so every company has these really unique intersections with this topic that can kind of yield unique benefits. But you have to have that mindset slanted towards ESG so that you can proactively identify the opportunities and the benefits, because we often talk about risks, but really the opportunities go overlooked, and try to capture them. The integration across the business is really critical for this long-term resiliency, especially from an operational perspective. Operations are intimately tied into ESG issues. And again, there are a lot of ways that we focus on risks when it comes to operations, when it comes to supply chain, but there are a lot of opportunities out there as well, including competitive advantage, including lower costs, including lower carbon emissions that may yield to some sort of B2B or B2C or business or consumer type advantage. But let me give you an example of how one company kind of had a risk that they really could have avoided. And I read about this in the book. In 2011, there was a confluence of issues, periods of heavy, intense rain, which is the E, the flow of urbanization along rivers, which is the S, and flood mismanagement by the government, which is a G, governance issue. This led to the shutdown of the hard drive industry in Thailand for weeks. And coincidentally, it was not, or the good thing was, it wasn't terribly disruptive. But in 2011, I was working at a semiconductor firm, and I remember that we were making parts for chips and hard drives, and we couldn't ship them anywhere because the factories were all underwater in Thailand. And what we heard on the back end were that many PC manufacturers had to slow down production because they couldn't source hard drives. So the hard drive firms kind of, they got up and running again relatively quickly, but it took that disaster for somebody to realize that they needed to take remediation steps. Now, the benefits of proactively realizing that would have been no disruption or minimal disruption, or maybe offshoring to another country, or what they ended up doing was raising the manufacturing off the first floor, which maybe in a flood might solve part of the problem, but still won't allow you to ship things if you're flooded. But still, there are opportunities to get ahead of these issues. And it's not only physical issues from the intense flow of climate change, but it's even like, if you have this ESG mindset, you can get ahead of regulations because you're looking at the way that your business operates, and you can get ahead possibly of some of what the government is thinking about. Like, maybe there are harmful plastics that you need to reduce, and maybe those will be regulated over the long terms. So not even like just disclosure regulations, but regulations that may come and impact your business. An ESG mindset could help you get ahead of that, and that's yet another benefit that it brings.
That's awesome. And one of the things, so full disclosure, I'm in the process of reading your book. I'm in page, I think, 175, chapter 6 or 7, I don't remember well. So it's really good. So obviously for everybody that is listening to this book club, you're more than welcome to buy Matthew's book. That is really, really good. And so I really like how you always try to connect the importance of companies identifying ESG with risk and opportunities, because I think that should be a big part of that ESG mindset. And I have to say from experience that when you start talking with companies on invite them to understand their most important E, S, and G issues, they don't see the connection at the beginning. They don't see the connection with risk and opportunities. They are thinking maybe more about, reputation or compliance with regulation or developing a report, or that is important, but again, I think one of the things that I like the most of this book is that you are connecting this with risk and opportunities. So obviously you already mentioned that part of the reason that you make that connection is because of your background, the work on the financial sector. But now that you write this book, what is your approach about the importance of connecting ESG with risk and opportunities?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think a lot of companies do look at it from one thing you said, which is that reputational risk perspective. And that to me is kind of table stakes. If you're doing things, if your operations are sustainable, and many companies and many investors will recognize that we're in a transition, but if you're putting in the effort to be sustainable for today, and you're doing things like social justice or making your company inclusive, those are all great things that are kind of table stakes. What's interesting about ESG, and what really drew me to it once I started thinking about it, was that interconnected nature of the risks and opportunities. And so besides just being an acronym like E, S, and G, environmental, social, and governance, which each have unique kind of approaches, there is an interconnection between them all. So ESG is very much an acronym, I believe, that was put together with some intention. The issues all kind of flow in and flow out of each other across these pillars. So often when I see news articles, or especially business articles, I often look at it and I say, well, this is clearly like an environmental issue, but what is the social impact? How does this impact the business? And what ultimately I realized is that ESG is a unique tool for addressing the world as the way that it is. A lot of issues that are hitting, a lot of crises that are hitting companies today are what the World Economic Forum has coined as a polycrisis, which is kind of a series of these interconnected risks intersecting around the company. Like a very easy example is, and I don't think I wrote about this in the book, but it's like how the Suez Canal was being attacked by pirates. Meanwhile, the Panama Canal, just a couple months ago, it was experiencing massive drought, right? Like, so if you're a logistics company, you have two major canals that are experiencing pretty heavy issues. Now, in the book, I do write about one example that I give is commercial real estate. 80% of commercial real estate lending is needing to be refinanced through 2025. With the rise of COVID and hybrid work, many real estate offices are not at capacity or even near it. So companies are thinking, do I offload this asset? Do I refinance? And then even with extreme climate, there is risks along these coastal cities. So like these risks are kind of coming around commercial real estate into this own poly crisis that intersects at the acronym. Another example is here in the US, we have something called the CHIPS Act, which is a government investment to onshore semiconductor manufacturing. Now, I have a semiconductor background, coincidentally, and I know that semiconductor manufacturing requires a lot of water because you think about clean rooms and things like that. Where they're making heavy investments is in one of our Western states, Arizona, which has not only experienced population growth, meaning they need more water, but it also has been having many droughts over the past few years. So if I'm looking to onshore a semiconductor facility, would I go to a place with a high population, the S, drought, the E? Is that the best place where I could make a good long-term investment? Like, we can't deal with this world of interconnected risks like this with how companies are set up today. Because my background is actually mostly in IT. And so in IT, I would see the structure of the company because you're effectively supporting the technology stack that runs all of the business. And what I observed is many of those technology stacks are completely siloed. So getting a holistic view of how the company is operating is extremely difficult. And a company can't deal with these interconnected risks with internal data silos or by looking at ESG kind of in silos. So very much in the book, I try to really you're far enough in the book now, even when I talk about like those E, S, and G early chapters, like chapters 3, 4, and 5, I'm kind of pulling the thread, like these issues are not just E, S, and G, even though I broke the chapters up this way, they very much flow into each other.
That's really good. And following your book, as you mentioned, you have a chapter about environmental, about social, about governance, but you have a chapter only dedicated to technology, and you mentioned that we maybe should be talking about E, S, G, and T. So obviously, as you already mentioned, I imagine that is quite connected with your background, with your work. But can you tell us a little bit more about why technology should be like a quite relevant topic to also consider at the same level of E, S, and G?
Oh, absolutely. So the idea for technology kind of being a fourth pillar of ESG came from the person who wrote the foreword of my book, actually. Andrea Bonin-Blanc coined ESGT in her book, which is called Gloom to Boom, back in 2018. And she's a very good friend of mine now because we talk about this all the time. But the acronym ESG was coined around 2003, 2004. Now, if you think about what was going on at the time, I was in IT at the time, and very much we were considered a cost center. Technology hadn't been really the enabler of value yet that it would end up being. The iPhone was still 4 years away from being a product even, and the app economy, things like that. So technology never really had a chance to be kind of a fourth pillar of ESG with when it was launched. But I am convinced that had ESG been coined just after the iPhone came out, it would have been the fourth pillar. And the reason is because for two reasons. One, today technology underpins business. Full stop. Like I mentioned intangibles earlier, a lot of intellectual property is built on technology, and a lot of the data insights that we need for making valuable business decisions sits in data, which is on technology. So ESG and technology have a relationship because it's so fundamental to business. But on the other side, like any of the pillars of ESG, the technology pillar has the same risks and opportunities as ESG. Especially if you consider something like cybersecurity. So ESG all have their own risks and opportunities. Technology, though, as you grow technology stack in a company, new risks emerge. Like I write about in the book cybersecurity and the Colonial Pipeline hack that took down the US gas pipeline. I forget what year it was, 2021, or social bias in AI. Like, there are risks that when you leverage technology, you need to bring, but there are also massive opportunities because you can now reach a global audience with your brand through technology. Now, granted, that can also bring risks depending on where your stakeholders are. So I added that in as kind of a fourth chapter there because I really thought that, boy, technology has a really unique intersection with business that really management teams kind of need to think about a little bit deeper than maybe they are today.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I really like that part of the book because I'm also starting to see that in conversation with clients, when we have the chance to help update their ESG topics. Now you identify like an emerging topic is artificial intelligence, or like a very relevant topic now is, as you mentioned, cybersecurity. So it's now when you try to identify the most relevant topics, is there. So in a way, yeah, it's happening already. The relevance of technology when companies trying to identify and manage, key ESG issues. I'm aware of time, so I want to ask you a couple of additional questions to wrap up this conversation. And again, thanks a lot, Matthew, or Matt. I think now I can call you Martin.
Either way.
I want to ask you about, as you can imagine, more and more people, especially Gen Zs, millennials, they really want to work for companies that connect with their purpose, that also, are managing or are making contribution to solve some of the environmental and social challenges that we are facing as a society. And so in a way, for example, what I'm seeing also is that more and more people want to work or support the ESG work of their companies, and no matter that maybe they don't have like a sustainability role or title in their organizations, but they are in a way wanting to make a contribution from their positions. So why a book like ESG Mindset it's relevant for like these people that maybe don't have a sustainability title but want to make a contribution, want to have an ESG mindset?
Yeah, this is actually a core theme of the book. So because ESG comes at these topics through the context of the business, I really believe that it can be a path for anybody who's trying to make that change, garner management team attention, and get the funding that they need to move forward with specific projects. Now, this is, again, not going to be a win-win, but it is a path for a lot of these people. And I totally agree with you. Like post 2020, I see this across actually all ages. Employees are filled with a newfound sense of purpose. We just came out of a global pandemic. There's lots of social unrest. People are seeing the effects of extreme weather at home where they live. And they're trying to figure out how to channel this energy into their job. And I do believe that every unique role has an opportunity to drive change. But if you're an employee at a business and you're trying to drive that change through the business, I think what you'll find is approaching it with a material lens is better than I don't want to say the word better, maybe more productive than trying to stand up something that's philanthropic. And the reason why I say that is a lot of those philanthropic efforts, when economic times go south, one of the first things that will be cut are those philanthropic programs. And those are also very difficult to fund. But if you're going to a business leader and you're saying, you know what, I've taken a look at our product, and I believe that in the next 5 years, the cost of fossil fuels is going to go up, and we need to start considering other types of fuels because this is just too volatile. We need to kind of normalize our fuel purchase, and maybe it's some other more sustainable fuel. Maybe it's electrification. Like going to a leader with that type of story will get attention versus trying to say, I think we should go plant trees somewhere. Now, granted, there is benefits to doing that, especially in Latin America and South America. Like, there are areas of the world where we need to roll back deforestation. And there are, again, what we talked about earlier, some of that reputational risk management can be gained by doing those projects, but it is still very difficult to make it sticky unless you come at it from the perspective of the business. So, for example, I wrote a book. I'm working with a publisher. That publisher, coincidentally, if you look at the one of the early pages, I forget what it's called, but like with all the like the ISBN number and stuff, it says that the publisher supports sourcing from sustainable forests. For them, that is a material issue. Every company has these types of issues. And the way to capitalize on that purpose is to go after those issues to start, because not only will they get funded, but it is a way for the management team to also capitalize on something really unique, which is one, employees and their newfound sense of purpose, and two, the unique employees' human capital that they have about your business. Everybody understands, nobody understands your business as best as the employees. If you can match those two things up, you have a huge recipe for success. That's
really, really good. And I want to close this conversation. I want to ask you, so now you're an author working on ESG. So I imagine that you're having more and more conversations on ESG. This is an example of that. I imagine that when you wrote the book, and you were not imagining that you were going to have an ESG book club with a Latin American community. So that's the beauty of globalization also. And so I want to ask you, is anything in your ESG mindset changed since you have your book already finished and you are having all these new conversations because of now you having this book available for people to read?
You know what, there is one thing. So I also write a newsletter called the ESG Advocate.
And it's really good. It's really good. And people are more than welcome to go and read your newsletter. And it's really, really good.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. There's one thing that I realized just 2 weeks ago, so maybe a couple weeks by the time we show this, which is that even though the interconnected nature of these pillars really is what drew me to this topic, one thing I hadn't considered when I was writing the book is each pillar is unique. Each pillar does have its own chapter dedicated to it, but I hadn't considered just how each one is evolving kind of independently. And what's happening is we're seeing levers get pulled across the E, the S, and the G in different ways. So, for example, there is a lot of legislation here in the US around the E. There's a lot of conservative states that are trying to push back on it, but there is also a lot of interesting litigation with the E where individual citizens are suing some of the bigger polluters, trying to reclaim like things that they see happening. There's a great case from a Peruvian farmer who's suing RWE for their contribution to climate change, for example. And that case is still ongoing, I believe, but there are places where these people are winning. For the S, we're seeing all sorts of different things in the US. Again, I'm in the US, so I see what happens here a little bit more, but there's a lot of litigation happening around the social as well. And it's not very positive here in the US, unfortunately. With the governance piece, what we're seeing is a lot of proxy voting. There's a lot. So if you're not familiar, like investors will log proxy resolutions because part of owning a company is being able to influence that company through your vote. And what we're seeing in the US is a lot of really interesting, and globally, we're seeing a lot of really interesting proxy resolutions be logged and a mix of activity on activist investors or ESG investors kind of pushing companies to do the right thing. So if I had to say, like, again, one thing that I hadn't considered is just kind of how these things are each progressing along uniquely, despite the interconnected nature of the acronym.
That's really good. Now, just to give you an example, because I completely agree that each letter is evolving in a very different way. And it depends a lot of each region, because just to give you an example, with the E, in the context of Latin America, for example, at this moment in a country like Colombia, biodiversity is like a key topic. First, because as you mentioned in one of your answers, we need to prevent or try to work on reducing deforestation. That's key for us. So there is a lot of conversation around that. But Colombia is hosting the COP16, that is this biannual event that is about biodiversity and nature. So a lot of companies here in Colombia are talking a lot about biodiversity and the role on this. And the other example is what's happening in, for example, a country like Brazil that have this horrible flood in the south of Brazil, and like making a huge impact on people, on businesses, on how government is dealing with climate refugees inside their own country. Absolutely. So because of those kind of things, you don't have, we have polarization, obviously, as many countries in the world with our political parties, but there is no polarization about climate change, because it's quite evident that the issue is a reality in a region like South America. So completely agree. What is happening on the E, the S, and the G is evolving in different ways, and it's going to depend also on the circumstances and realities of each region. So that's part of the challenge. And I imagine for like a multinational company that is having, businesses all around the world, maybe you need to be more cautious about talking about the E in the US, but you need to be quite proactive talking about America or Europe or some markets in Asia. So that's part of the challenge for companies also.
That is very true. And you bring up so many good points. The only thing I would add is, with globalization, even those localized issues are now globally impacting. So like, I have a coworker who works in Brazil, and I was like pinging him, "Are you okay down there?" Like, I hope you're okay, because I saw the flooding, and it's, there's up here in the US, like people are reaching out to me globally, because I work and live along the East Coast, and we're under a heat dome right now. So it's over 100 degrees Fahrenheit here, and which is highly unusual. So people are reaching out to me like, "Hey, are you okay?" Ultimately, like, we are all at the center of this, and the way that we have connected our modern world, you cannot avoid this at all.
Of course. And coming back to globalization and to wrap up this conversation. So your book is now available, I don't know how many countries, a lot.
All of them. It should be globally available. I just got word this week that it will be available in Portuguese in October.
That's really good. That's really good. We need to work on the Spanish version.
Right.
But on that note, please, let's finish with an invitation from you to people to read your book. Why people should read ESG Mindset?
Sure. I really think that the book itself, through a book like ESG Mindset, a company can understand its unique intersections with these topics and create long-term resilience. I open the book with, this book is not going to save the world. I personally want to save the world. But the book helps businesses create that long-term resilience so that they last long enough to save the world if they so choose. And I really think many will choose to do that. The path through that sustainability and impact really flows through, for a business, flows through the context of your business. But I encourage you all, like, check out the book. Let me know what you think. Feel free to write a review. If you like it, reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm always happy to connect to people, especially globally. And like I mentioned, I write a newsletter called the ESG Advocate. I like to test new ideas out there. So if you're interested, it's over on Substack. You can look it up, ping me on LinkedIn. And definitely let me know what you think. I'm super excited that it's out there now.
That's awesome. That's awesome. It's getting a lot of traction in Latin America, as you know. So no, it's really good to have these opportunities for people to learn more about you, and that this creates a motivation for them to read your book. So Matt, thanks a lot for your time, and looking forward to continue to be in contact.
Thanks. I really appreciate it again, and take care, everyone.
Thank you. Let me switch to Spanish to wrap up. So, gracias a todos por acompañarnos en una nueva edición ya estaban hablando en inglés, del Club de Lectura. Y bueno, los esperamos y seguiremos con estos espacios los últimos miércoles de cada mes. Matt, thanks a lot. Bye.